This is your instructor for EDAD 588, Allocation and Use of Resources, or School Finance. We're going to provide today just a quick introduction to issues in school finance that will guide us as we discuss critical elements of this in the course. We'll begin by just providing sort of a theoretical and philosophical and historical context to school finance. Really, a lot of the origins of public education began at the nexus of the 19th and the 20th centuries, and one of the great thinkers in early public administration that represented a strand of thinking called the pedagogical progressives, represented by John Dewey. Dewey's focus was sound educational theory. Much of his ideas and many of his ideas were mangled and misappropriated by allies and critics, but generally Dewey recommended a very child-centered reflective theory with experiential engagement. It was very pedagogically based, and many referred to it as the pedagogical progressives because it was very child-centered and very similar to much of the work that you see in schools using today, things like project-based education and a curriculum that is a more fluid, child-centered curriculum. The other strand of thinking was really led by Edward Thorndike, and this is the administrative progressive group, the group that began advocating public education and looking at the challenges that public education was beginning to have in the early 20th century in dealing with the flurry of new students that resulted from immigration, the challenges of the great economic collapse of the 1920s, and even the collapse that occurred in the 1890s, and much of the political change that was taking place through the transition between the two centuries. Thorndike really focused on the efficiency and used the testing movement as a way to create a very efficient model of a modern school system, the one best system it's often referred to, using management principles that guided this. This because of the conflict and changes that occurred that I referred to with economic depression, immigration, the administrative progressives sort of win this ideological struggle. And the emphasis of public education begins more to take the focus of sorting students, effectively and efficiently managing them, allocating resources, using the Taylorist factory labor model, kind of this notion of scientific labor management, scientific learning management, this notion of being able to organize a system and all the students would go through it much the way factory system organizes the production of goods and services. So this becomes the guiding model, and as a result, school finance really begins to emerge focused more on this emphasis of social efficiency, resource allocation, and this factory model. And so the challenge with educational finance in the United States is that the U.S. system is a schizophrenic system of education. Funding is just as schizophrenic as control. The notion that local boards of education are the controlling entity is really something that occurred in the formative years of public education, but eventually states began to have a larger and larger role. And today, constitutionally, legally, the organ that controls public education really is the state. Since the 1960s, the federal government has put its hand in this, mostly around equity. Really, the ESSA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, that originated during President Johnson's Great Society program and the Civil Rights Movement in the mid-1960s really focused dollars from the federal government that were really generating equity, not so much funding education. And you can look at that by just following the money. In the 19th and 20th centuries, about 80% of the funding for education was local, from local tax, property taxes mostly, and 20% of the funding for education came from the state. By the mid-20th century and into the 21st century, the state begins to play a much larger role, as the legal role of the state is defined, so then follows the money. In most cases, in most districts around the United States, the state funds about half of all dollars that go to support public education. The other 40%, and again, depending on where, roughly comes from the local. So the local tax dollars, the local property taxes are part and parcel of it. And of course, the federal government providing equity-based funding in programs like Title I, IDEA, special education, encompasses about 10%. And so in policy, of late, since really the 1960s and since the federal government had increased its role, you begin to see equity and adequacy as the key buzzwords that we will spend some time in this course studying and evaluating. In fact, one of the books that we're going to read, the Education Economics book by Marguerite Rosa from Georgetown University, really focuses a lot on the whole equity and adequacy question. This really comes to the fore through the 14th Amendment and the notion that what is the role of the federal government in providing for an equitable and adequate education. And of course, 14,000 school districts with just as many levels of funding and the spreading of wealth based on poverty, based on where people live in certain neighborhoods. It's a very complex scenario, and the funds that are allocated for education, depending on your zip code and your street address, are quite different around the country. And of course, that is a major element of education finance, and one that you'll want to spend some time evaluating in your school and in your district. The U.S. Supreme Court very clearly, in two cases, Serrano versus Priest and Rodriguez versus the San Antonio Independent School District, mainly kept the U.S. government out of these questions. Equity of spending is not required per the U.S. Constitution. So the courts in both of these cases where the plaintiffs sued to say the school district is not providing me an adequate education, is not providing equity of dollars from one side of town to the other based on my street address, the Supreme Court basically said that's not a federal issue. Providing equitable education is a state issue. And so the ball then turned to local states, and equity and adequacy cases began to emerge at the state level. In Kentucky, this came to a head in 1989 in the famous Rose decision. The Rose decision is posted online, and the highlights of it, and I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with it, to read it, because it basically declared the Kentucky system unconstitutional and started from scratch, which is the funding formula through SEEK that we will learn about in this course. So all of that really has its roots in an equity and adequacy funding cases that culminated in Kentucky in the Rose decision, and that's really the funding that we use today in our public schools. Courts still struggle to define what equitable, adequate spending for education is, and there are several different ways to look at this, and again, that's a theme of the Education Economics book that you'll look at. One other element of education finance that I think it's important for us to understand as we look at issues in education finance, and that's the notion of rising costs. And there is a theory in economics that is very relevant to us, and it's Baumol's theory of rising costs. And it's the notion of the iron law of increasing costs. Costs always rise because education is an industry that can never enjoy productivity gains. And you think about it in relation to other industries like farming and manufacturing, those industries with technology became more productive. Prices fell. The amount of labor required in farming and even in manufacturing, as we're seeing in the evolving workforce of the current time we are in American history, you're seeing fewer and fewer people. Companies are finding ways, just as farms did in the early 20th and mid 20th century, they're finding ways to produce more with fewer people, and it's impacting the cost and the productivity of those different sectors of the economy. Education productivity has gone the other direction, and that's the point of Baumol's theory. Education productivity has gone from 1960, 6 workers per 100 students, to 2005, 12 workers per 100 students. In 1920, the average cost to educate a student was $1,000, and the cost as a percentage of the gross domestic product, which is the overall economy of the United States, was about 1%. So education as a sector encompassed 1% of the U.S. economy in 1920. In 2014, this explodes, and it exploded over time, as you'll see in the next couple of slides, but the average cost adjusted for inflation was about $12,000 per student. So those are real dollars relative to the cost of the 1920 average cost. So that's a major increase, and so the cost of the percentage of the GDP, education now encompasses 5.4% of the U.S. economy. And so while in some areas like farming and manufacturing, these numbers are totally inverted. The cost per unit goes down. The number of people required goes down. In education, it's gone the other way. And this is a major factor that is why education is such a political issue today. You can see these next 2 charts. Pardon the relative crude nature of these. These come right out of a textbook, but you can see the cost per pupil going from 1919 to 20, all the way, 454 all the way to 10,000, and the share of the federal, state, and local. And you can see what we just talked about, where a majority of the funds in 1919-20, 83% of the funds were local, 16% state, and a fraction of those funds federal. By 2008-9, you can see that the state encompasses 46%, the local 43%, and the federal almost 10%. The next chart shows you the same thing as far as the revenue and the production of education as part of the GDP, and it shows that education's costs are rapidly increasing. And again, that's a major problem and a major theme that we'll come back to in the course, and that's the issue in school finance and how to make education equitable, but also how to make it more efficient and productive. And the second book that we'll read in the course, the book that is focusing on sustainability, the Unsustainable book by McDonald, is a book that will focus on this latter portion of this lecture, and that's the notion of productivity and how education as a sector of the economy can work more efficiently and effectively. That concludes our introduction, and we will come back later and begin to introduce several elements of education funding, such as SEEK, which is the state education funding system.